In present day business culture, there's a lot of discussion around how do you empower your employees to get the most out of them, to grow the business, to make more money. Also, you could think about how do you run a building, an apartment, in a real estate point of view, and get the most out of your tenants where they feel empowered. They're paying their rent. Things are going well. There's a great upkeep of the building. And a lot of these discussions come down to community. And Empathize Others, we talk about community a lot. We're centered in community. So today's guest is an expert on community thinking in the business world, or how do we scale culture. So today we welcome Ron Lovett. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Empathize Others, the podcast. I love to bring on guests that have this connection to community, and we take a look at their lives from that angle of what's community. So when I think about people that I look up to around innovative business, linking community from a business point of view, thinking outside the box, someone that I've really been following over the last couple of years is our guest today. And that is entrepreneur, speaker, industry coach, Ron Lovett. Welcome to the podcast, Ron.
Hey, Augy. Thanks for having me.
Really excited to have you on today. You have such a diverse, I think about diversity when I think about your experiences. And it's great for, especially some of the young people that listen to the podcast, because, when we go through and we get, have this conversation, your life really speaks to, you can do a lot of different things in your life, right? And it still comes back to one point. So we usually start out kind of with your early life. And I know that we have a lot of similarities too, and we'll bring those up as we come along, but you grew up in Halifax. So I always start off with the question around, what would you say was your community, quote unquote, as you were growing up in your early life?
Yeah, I think about that, so when I was early life for me was West End by Halifax Shopping Center. We lived with my grandmother on Ralston Avenue off of Mumford Road. And that was a great community, and to me, the word community was really the friends and neighbors and people in that neighborhood. Like that was my first sense of community. Outside of, I also look at family as somewhat, when I think of the word community. So that was my, that and school. I think those were two communities for me. I went to St. Catherine's, and that had a different community than my neighborhood. But those were my first two memories of communities. My school community and my neighborhood community.
Yeah, and my dad's house is on Romans Avenue, so I'm right there by Ralston. Still in that area, which is what we in Halifax call the pubs, but it's public housing just off of Bayers Road. And then St. Catherine's, I know that we have a similarity because I went to Bloomfield School and my principal was Dick McLean. And your principal was Dick McLean. Dick. Yeah, and I do want to, go ahead.
No, sorry, you go.
No, I know that there's I have a stories of Dick being at Bloomfield, and he was that community type principal. He was he was approachable. He made you feel comfortable. And then you have a story of how Dick affected you and some of the errands he sent you on. So talk a little bit about Dick and the community at St. Catherine's.
Yeah. So St. Catherine's in I wouldn't have known him at the time, but looking back, was a bit of a rough school. Like there were some challenges at St. Catherine's, and there was division because I was in French immersion, and then you had the kids in the English school, and so there was kind of a division earlier on in that school. Funny enough, and so Dick, but I felt like Dick had this just larger than life energy. I mean, he used to really. Command respect from people, but he was so humble and respectful himself, and so it was a two-way street with Dick. And so my family name's Conley. My my mom's maiden name is Conley. And so Dick knew my uncle, Sean Conley. And they had fought years ago, actually. The story, I don't know if I had shared this with you, Augy, but my uncle went to St. Pat's and heard about this huge guy named Dick McLean, who was like massive. And people said, like, he's
Yes.
a tough guy in HRM. And my uncle Sean said, well, let's go figure that out. They get in the truck. They went up to Halifax West. And as the story goes, my uncle Sean kind of opened a classroom door and he was looking around and then he saw this giant in the back. And it was Dick McLean. And he said, hey, me and you were outside at lunchtime. So they went outside, and look, as kind of, good, clean fights go back then. They had a good fight. It was over very quickly. Uncle Sean, he was quite the scrapper, and they became very good friends afterwards, right? And lifelong friends. So when Dick found out I was Sean Conley's nephew, he would come up and he'd say, hey, you're going to be a tough kid. You're going to be a tough kid. And so from there, two stories come to mind. One is Dick used to take me to Bloomfield. Like when I was in trouble, he would take me after school and take me to boxing. Like I remember a few detentions were with Dick at Bloomfield, and that was an intimidating place to go as a young kid. And luckily someone like Dick would bring you in there, and, the smells and just the energy, it was intimidating because I would have been young at that time. And then
that's
there was another
boxing,
that's right.
boxing in the basement.
That's right. Because Dick, I mean,
yeah.
He was, I don't know if he was then, but I know at some point he was the head of the boxing association. Right. And so he obviously had large connections to boxing. And so he brought me there and introduced me to, who was a trainer back there? The two brothers, right? Wayne and Taylor Gordon. Right. Yeah, that's right. And so
son.
That's right. That's right. So those guys were trainers back then. And Dick would say, hey, this guy's going to be tough, and get him trained. And it was really interesting. And then, not too long after that, there was a kid that was kicked out of our school, and he's kicked out of every school. It's a kid from the pubs, and there was a young girl in the office, and Dick called me to the office, and he said, "Hey, there's this young girl. I want you to walk her home, and if this kid gives her a hard time, I want you to maybe look after that kid, sort him out, and bring him back to me to the office if you can." And I was like, "Wow, okay." And he said, "Get two of your toughest friends and walk her home." And sure enough, just like Dick said, we walked her home. We're walking through the pubs. He jumps out, with two poles swinging around, and we threw rocks at him. He ran, and we got her home safe.
The beginning of your security professional life, So, that's a great start, though, too, Ron, because I love the connections of community, because Dick did the same thing when he was at Bloomfield. I think he was at Bloomfield as principal before St. Catharines, because I'm a little bit older than you are. And he brought that same feeling to Bloomfield, like being able to relate to a wide range of students. And my brother was in Citadel boxing, with Raymond Downey, and there were many guys that Billy Downey, that were in the boxing club. So I didn't know we had that in common, but I can see Citadel boxing in my head right now. I can visualize that. So at St. Catharines for a bit, and then we swing to high school, which is, for us in Halifax, we know that we had Queen Elizabeth High School, which was supposedly the Protestant school, and you had St. Pat's, and you went to St. Pat's. In your journey of having a lot of places that you call home and community, how was it at St. Pat's as a youth?
Well, so even before that, because my junior high is, I think, a little interesting.
Okay.
I went to Fairview for 2 years, and I failed like 3 courses in grade 8. And Mr. Clark, I don't know if you know Mr. Clark, he was a principal there.
Jerry Clark.
Yeah, right. Yeah, Jerry Clark, great guy, really great guy, actually. I don't know if he's still around today, but
he is.
Anyway, he is, yeah. So if you ever talk to him, tell him I said hi. He probably remembers me. So he brought me into the office in grade 8. I had failed 3 courses, and he brought me in with my mother and said, look, I'm just going to give it to you straight. He said, all your son does here is ensure that nobody else can do their work. And he said, so we're going to give you a deal. We'll give you 1 free pass. You have to take summer school, but you have to go. If you're not going to repeat the grade, you have to go to a different school. So I went to Cornwallis, which was like a fish, out of sea, right? For me, Cornwallis was just, I didn't know anybody there. I played basketball at the Steelers, so there was, I guess, some kids from the Norwood Knights team or whatever, that a few kids that I knew, but it was an odd school for me to go to, but it was probably good. It hit the reset button. I think I did better from an education perspective, grade 9, then St. Pat's in grade 10. And St. Pat's was really rough for me. I had a rough go. St. Pat's was really challenging.
Yeah, and there was, as we know, for those people that are familiar with Halifax, the range of St. Pat's was all the way from Mulgrave Park to the North End to some of the kids in Fairview, because you could go to Halifax West, but you could also go to St. Pat's.
Yeah.
And then you had the South End. So the kids at Cornwallis, the school that you're talking about, just off of Quimpool, they all went to St. Pat's. So there was a mix, and the same mix happened at QEH, but getting along. So as you were in St. Pat's as a youth, and at that point, it seems as though you had a different stopping point. So St. Catharines, and then
Yeah.
Timberley, and then Fairview Junior. So once you get to St. Pat's,
I'm living in
what do you?
Armdale now. When I go to St. Pat's, I'm in Armdale by Cowie Hill.
Wow. Okay. So, what are you thinking about? You get your feet under you a little bit at Cornwallis academically in St. Pat's, even though it wasn't a great experience. What's on your mind? Like, what are you going to do? Like, what do you want
Well,
to do?
I mean, that's a really good and broad question, I think, because, and it's funny, when I think back today, Augie, I hated school. I just didn't enjoy it. And now, look, it took me until mid to late 30s to find out that I had ADHD and am dyslexic. In school, that's like horrible. You're just a class clown, pain in the ass,
Yeah.
and so I did not enjoy school. And it's funny because today I love to learn. I love to learn.
Yes.
But no
Yes.
one was able to tap into that back then. Very few and far between could teachers tap into what to the ability that I have today. And maybe that's changed in public schools, but St. Pat's was tough, because I hung out in every neighborhood. I spent time in Uniacke Square, Mulgrave Park, and Spryfield, North End. I was just like this nomad of. I probably had friends in all neighborhoods, but then that came. Sometimes that was a problem because if there was clashes between neighborhoods, I kind of got caught in the
Yes.
middle, right? And
Yeah. Yeah.
that's where my trouble started, was in St. Pat's. It was a few weeks in, I got caught in the middle of a big fight between a guy from my neighborhood and a guy from Mulgrave Park, actually Uniacke Square, and it was bad. It was just, and from there it was trouble for me for a little while.
Yeah, and what a great, when we look back, I often see when I have these conversations, Ron, the seeds of somebody. So we've had Jordan Croucher on, and we're going to talk about Jordan's connection with you. We had Derico Simons on. There were people that talked about, here's where I was when I was young. And then when we reflect back, that seed of St. Pat's and you having the versatility to be in different spaces actually becomes part of what you do as an adult, like to be
Right.
able to kind of think outside the box and be versatile. The other thing I would think about is mediating things. So your first business is security, like, and so from Dick McLean sending you out on a security detail, right, to navigating and mediating these things at St. Pat's, because I remember St. Pat's dances were the powder keg of these community clashes, right? So from Uniacke Square
Yeah.
to Mulgrave Park to Spryfield to Fairview and the pubs, you were allowed to invite anyone to St. Pat's dances at the time. And
Yep.
so, post dance used to be, it's
That's where my
midnight.
trouble was.
Yeah, yeah, it's midnight, and so I can visualize where you're at that
Yeah.
point. So now I do know that you finish up at St. Pat's. You kind of get the travel bug then.
Yeah.
Explain a little bit about you at 19.
Yeah. I guess I'll go 18. So my father was from Florida, and I never met him. So I was born. Those who know me from way back from St. Catherine's days know me as Ronald Francis Poe the Third. That was my born name. And then my mom remarried this guy when I was, I guess, I don't know, 8 or 9, something like that. When we lived in Timberley, that was her first home, post my grandmother's, and so anyway, it was at 18, I was still searching for a potential relationship that I didn't have. I didn't have a father relationship because my stepfather and my relationship was awful. We didn't communicate, didn't even talk, actually. It just wasn't a healthy relationship. And so I got a letter from an uncle and I was 18, living on the corner of Preston and Jennings Street in the just off
Yes.
Jubilee. It was my first apartment at 18. And I remember getting a letter from a guy he's now passed away, but he was an uncle of mine, and his name was Bob. And he said, "Hey, look, I know you don't know your father, but I don't see why there's still an opportunity to get to know your family down here in North Carolina and different places. And if you like, I'd like you to meet them. And if you want, I can connect you with your father." And so that pushes me to like 19. I wrote back and said, "Yeah, here's my phone number, and love to talk to my father." And because I think, as I look at other people's relationships with step parents, they're like olives, right? They're like love or hate. And I just unfortunately was on the not enjoying side of that. And so I was really open to and really longing for this father figure relationship. And so I get a call one day, and it's from one of my roommates, Doug Townsend, who owns a canteen today. And Doug, I remember I'm driving my car, and he said, "You will not believe who I just talked to on the phone." And I was like, Who? It was a girl I met on the weekend or something. He said, "No, it was your father. Your father called." And I was like, I almost crashed the car. And so from there, this is kind of interesting, but I go to Florida. I meet him for the first time. I'm like 20 now. And, I knew through conversations that the guy was a bit of a bullshitter, had lived a bit of a wild life just through the things he would say and comments he would make. And I was able to call BS at a young age. I met a lot of interesting people from a lot of different neighborhoods. And so I had learned street smarts and be able to read people as a young age just from my environment. And so I knew my dad was just full of it a lot of the time. And so I go to meet him. I stay for a month in Orlando, Florida, and he's like a superintendent building what's called Lowe's home improvement stores, kind of like a Walmart. And it's just a bad experience. I talk about, actually, I open my book, Outrageous Empowerment, with my experience of my father, like, sitting down in a trailer, watching a movie, which to me, I was like, oh my God, I'm finally watching a movie with my father. This is huge. This is what I saw my friends do. And, things that people take for granted. If you're dad, you take
Yeah.
that for granted, but you don't have a dad, you don't take that. You're like, this is a big moment. Boom, he falls asleep, So these were crushing moments for me as an early, in my early 20s. And so that relationship didn't work out. I came back but I met a girl, and in I don't know, one of the nightclubs there, and I guess I was 20-ish, and I stayed in touch with her. And then my first trip was England, South Africa for 2 months to spend time with her and her family, and travel South Africa and Australia. So that was
Okay.
where I started with travel. And sorry for the long-winded story, but it actually went from my father to meeting this girl from Pretoria, South Africa, and then went there to visit her.
No, I like that, and you can never long-winded, because the podcast is about that, Ron. And I love, because there's often things that people say on the podcast, and people, "Wow, I didn't know that about Ron Lovett. I didn't know that about Steve Konchowski. I didn't know that about
Right.
Jordan Croucher." And so that does make a really nice connection to, you come back. How did you get to the beginnings of Source Security then?
Yeah. So when I came back, my sister was playing soccer at the Mount St. Vincent, and I just thought, maybe I should try that. I mean, look, quick funny side story. Here's how horrible I was at school. I always tell the story. I had a 57 in math, right, when I graduated St. Pat's, and I was trying to get it to like 65. So I was going to night school to upgrade. Now, of course, I just cut school. I was the only person with a car. I cut school halfway, and we go to the Graywood, and drink all the time. And so I usually when I was having a few drinks, I would call my teacher, Mr. West, and usually just torture him at around 2 or 3 a.m. And I think he didn't enjoy it, but he kind of enjoyed it a little bit too. And so anyway, I'll never forget. Night school's over, and I call him up. I'm having some drinks. It's literally 2 a.m. The poor guy, right? And he says, "Ron, geez, it's 2 a.m." And I said, "Yeah, sorry, Mr. West, just want to see what you're up to." And he goes, "Look, he says, I got to get to it." He goes, "I got good news and bad news." And I'm like, "Well, what is it?" He goes, "Well, good news is you passed." And I'm like, "I passed?" I'm like, that's great news. I'm like, "I passed night school. This is big." He goes, "Well, bad news is," he goes, "I've been teaching night school for 25 years, and you're the first person to ever pay $140 to downgrade from a 57 to a 50. He said, I like you, Ron. He said, if you want to give you, I'll just let you keep your old mark. I said, thanks, Mr. West. I'll keep the old one. So from there, I traveled, and then I thought I'd try the Mount because it was half price for second sibling, and I paid myself. My mom wasn't going to
Yes.
pay for it, didn't have the money, but it was like $200 a course. So I paid for that, went there, and then I did my second trip. I did a semester. I took 2 half credits, and then I went traveling again. And this time um, I went to Spain, Italy, France, Morocco, Northern Africa. And
Mhm.
I just was learning so much at that time, right? Those 2 trips, I wasn't a tourist, I was a traveler. And
Yeah.
I was learning about culture and food and different things. And I'd learned so much. And I thought, geez, this is the type of learning. Like I had found the learning that I wanted, and that I
Nice.
was able to tap into the learning I needed, and that works for me. And it is through traveling and meeting people and asking questions. And I use my senses more than just taking information off a page in some cases. And look, I'm a selfish learner. If I enjoy it, I like it. If I don't, my ADHD kind of just takes over, and I
Yes.
think of other
Yes.
things. So that's
No,
where it
that's
started. Yeah.
yeah, and it's again, I'm not intent listener, and so when you're talking, I often see curriculum and learning is way beyond school. So as you're traveling, there's something about and not being a tourist, but being a traveler, and I
Right.
experienced that too, Ron, when I went to teach in the Caribbean, and I really enjoyed not knowing stuff. Like because when you travel, you're vulnerable. You don't really know the language usually. You don't know the customs, but there's a learning that goes on. And so that resonates with me, that it really triggered inside of you. Yes, I am a learner and I like to learn certain things. And so this really kind of, it starts to go into your personal life, your professional life, that as you're now in your 20s and you're figuring it out, I just love how your story is building the foundation for understanding people from a different perspective.
Yeah. Yeah. Look. Yeah.
Yeah, you do that. So as you're like, so now the security business, because Jordan Croucher in his podcast episode with us said that you hired him, to do some static security, which led to him getting a support worker job, right,
Yes.
at QEH at the time. So um, I know I've heard the story of how you got into jujitsu, Gracie,
Right.
security. Give a little bit of that leading up to Source Security.
Sure. So it actually continues on the traveling front. So I came back, and I was doing a sales job for TELUS, doing kind of outside sales, commission based sales, and then I did another trip. I did Costa Rica, Panama, Colombia, 3 months, and and I like kind of living on the edge a little bit, and I was in trouble back here, into marijuana business and stuff, and so I kind of like living on the edge, and so Costa Rica was fun. I enjoyed it. Panama was interesting. I was involved in my first earthquake in Bocas del Toro on an island. And then I was curious about Colombia, and everyone said, don't go to Colombia. There's 350 Americans kidnapped today. And I was like, I'm going to Colombia. Like, I'm also grew up, like, don't tell me what not to do. I do it right away. That was a really dumb thing for me to hear, right? Because I'm going to do it. So I went to Colombia, and it was in northern Colombia. There's a place called Santa Marta, and there's a park called Park Tayrona, which I heard today is quite built out. But back then, there was nobody there, and there was no travelers in Colombia. There was a couple, one guy from the UK, like literally there was a dozen of us. Most were from Israel, like guys and girls from Israel, few Australians, no Americans. And so there was the same group you'd see going place to place, and then we stayed in hammocks in open huts. That's where you slept. Like I'm talking the middle of nowhere. And, I was lost in the jungle up there. I mean, just stuff that was crazy when I think of even my friends that I thought were crazy talk to me today, and they're like, you were great. Like you would go to these crazy places, and, and you would call us and say, hey, do you want to come? I'm going to Colombia. And they'd say, well, who's going? And I'd say, well, just me. And they'd say, no, I'm not going. That's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. Now, it makes me laugh now, but so I was training Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu at the time, and I had trained I was training under Renzo Gracie in New York. That's where I was getting my belts. You go fight his students, you beat them, he gives you a belt. And I thought I could be a bodyguard at the time. I thought, I've got this kind of unique ability. I can look after myself. I can read people, read energy. not in, but you don't know what you don't know. And what I didn't know is there was no work to be a bodyguard, no full time at Halifax. Like, it wasn't going to happen. And so I'm reading a book on the beach in Park Tyrone in Colombia about this. I think it was called One Hell of a Ride. And it was about an English gangster named David Courtney who used to rent his friends out to nightclub security companies. He wasn't the company, but they were like, hey, I need some tough guys. He would give him his friends and he'd make $2 an hour. And before I left for Colombia, I was working at a few bars, and I was, I mean, I had a horrible name, Augy, in Halifax as a shithead, and someone who caused trouble. I was kicked at every bar when I was 18 in a few restaurants. I mean, I was just, I was kicked at the house 3 times, barred before I was 19 too. So before I left, a few bars were using me to kind of keep the places cleaned up, like Planet Pool. I would show up with my own metal detector, and I was respected, and so I could, had no problem. Everybody would behave when I was there. I'd kick them out. And so I was doing that at a few bars, went to Colombia, read this book, had this idea to start a nightclub security company. And when I came back, Remo, who's passed now from Copacabana, and a few other bar owners would say, hey, could you come back? These places got a little messy where you're gone. I said, I will, but I had some leverage. I said, not as Ron Lovett, but it's as a company. I need to run the security at the bar. And that's how we started in 2001 was Source Security was born.
Nice. No, that's a great, and everything links together. Again, as you tell this growth story, it really links together. And as I said, you were also, because you had your connections with so many communities. I know even in our African Nova Scotia community, a lot of people know you, and a lot of young guys or guys your age would say, "Hey, hire me," and they trusted you. You trusted them because these are guys that might not have been hired by other security companies, but you were like, so it blows up, right? Like that one idea, because you were getting the right people who had the same skills you talk about, Ron. Like when you show up to the club and you're drinking and you're a young person, and one of the tougher guys around is kind of at the door, you behave yourself. And when these tougher guys became multiple, now your company's growing. So it grows to a point where you end up doing more than just nightclub, right? You get into static.
Yeah, static. And my first personal security gig was Ringo Starr, 2006. I went to hired by a company out of Ontario. I went to the Casino Rama in Aurelia, and I was Ringo Starr's bodyguard for a month. And that was, nice. Think about that. It was wild. I had no business. I didn't even know who he was. I didn't nothing about the Beatles. I had to get a picture. I was freaked out at the airport. Wasn't even know what this guy looked like. And it was a good experience, but I had no training at all. I was just a guy that ran doors in Halifax. That I thought it was wild as I look back. And I was there for 1 month trying to run. I remember we were doing security for the Trailer Park Boys. People weren't showing up, and this is the static security. It was a disaster. Michael Clattenburg calling me, yelling at me, and there was no good phone plans at the time. And I'm not joking, Augie. My phone bill was more than I was getting paid to be Ringo's bodyguard. Like, it was so stupid. It was so bad.
Yeah. So then, like, these are the foundations for your first book too. So outrageous empowerment. You're starting to, because now you're an expert in business thinking. So at that point, what are you realizing about the running a business and connecting with your employees? Because I think that's something that you started to get an expertise in.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I think of this in phases. I think I always was able to make people feel comfortable. You went back to this earlier, and everybody from Jordan to a lot of guys that I grew up with or knew from different neighborhoods, and I was able to kind of bring people together back to kind of facilitating and finding common ground. And I feel like I had maybe just a natural ability at that, because my eyes were open to so many different things. So I didn't have some of the biases that maybe other people had, because I spent so much time. And I mean, look at Jordan. Jordan was like my best buddy growing up. I mean, I lived at his house, I mean, Leighton and Debbie. And I remember, just a quick side story, but I remember one time I was sleeping over and Jordan says, it's not good. Your mom's on the phone. It's not looking so good. And I said, what do you mean? So I get the phone and my mom says, where are you? What are you doing? I said, nothing. I'm just hanging out at Jordan's house. I've been there for 2 days at this point or something. She goes, well, we get, there's a problem. And I said, what's the problem? She goes, Well, our power bill has been through the roof for the last 3 months, and it's not good. And I said, well, why do I care? Like, well, I don't care about the power bill. And she's, well, you don't care until we opened your closet door and found all the marijuana plants. So get your ass home. And I was like, oh shit.
Oh
Yeah.
no.
So yeah, it was wild. But yeah, and so look back to just tapping into people, and Jordan, yeah, he worked as a student resource officer, and we started that position we had it in various high schools. We called it SRO, Student Resource Officer Program. It was a plainclothes student security. And Jordan, I mean, Jordan's just such a humble guy. We weren't looking for tough guys. Jordan was never a tough guy. We were looking for people with the ability to make people feel welcome and to make, that wasn't confrontational, didn't have an ego. And Jordan just checked
Yes.
all those boxes. He was perfect. Jordan wasn't a troublemaker. He didn't even make divisive comments. He was more silly and a warm personality. So that's why Jordan was chose, not because he could look after himself, And so the security company gave me the ability to tic-tac-toe. What does a situation really require? Not just what the customer is asking for, but what am I seeing based on my own experience or knowledge? And then how do I fit a good individual or someone that I think fits the bill in there? And look, it didn't work out every time either. Sometimes that was very challenging.
Of course, of course. No, and so I did. I've been, as I said, I've been following and listening to your podcasts and interviews, you and I both were interviewed by John DeMont at Saltwire, and I listened to your whole interview, and there's a. I now see there's something going on where you're starting to realize about empowerment of employees. And I
Right.
know that there were ways that you started to think outside the box as far as what you can offer someone that's working for you. And we often think about security guards as well, lower level. They're not the smartest guys. Like there's these misconceptions, and those
Right.
misconceptions can lead to us treating people badly, low wage, fire, like we think they're expendable. What started to come to your mind? So as you're going and you're kind of source security's growing up, blowing up, you sell the company. Now your entrepreneurial spirit is bubbling. What are you starting to see now is what you want to do going forward with businesses and people who work for you?
Well, can I rewind? Because I think there's a part that's important about the security company that I'll call it an aha moment on tapping
Okay.
into what I call untapped potential, right?
Okay.
And it's interesting because it probably, as we're talking out loud about this, and you think about this Jordan Crochard situation, right? And so to me, as we're talking through this, that is tapping into Jordan's maybe untapped potential. Me saying that's his zone of genius. He's a charismatic guy, blah blah blah. And so, but as the company grew and scaled, the one thing that always helped me dig into these strategies was relationships. And what I mean by that is, Augy, at this point, we had security guards in Vancouver. And so I would get on a plane, I'd go to the site, bring a security guard a coffee, and it'd be someone from India. And I'd talk to them about, like, so tell me about you and your family, and why did you come here? And what did you do before you came here? And then boom, you'd find out that this person was the CFO of a large company
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
India, and now he's here. And I would be like, oh my God, you were like the lead accountant, you were CFO for a large corp, and you did this for your family, and you have all those incredible skills. And I'm not knocking what you're doing today, but you're sitting here for $12 an hour writing security reports about trucks that come in and out. What a horrible use of your brain, or some of your
Yes.
brain. And so
Yeah.
the wheels started to turn to, how do you tap into untapped potential? Because we all can do a few things, but we have so much potential. We can do so much else. And and even though we had hired individuals for certain jobs, when I started to get to know them and look at the entire individual and their skills as a human being, and then say, well, how do we tap into that? That was really interesting. That's when things started to change, right? And that's what turned the company around. That was a big aha moment, is tapping into untapped potential. And that's why the subtitle of the book is giving employees their brains back. Not that they didn't have brains. I just wanted to get the usage of their brains. What I found, the industry took it from them.
I love that. I love that. And coming from a marginalized community, Ron, it even, resonates with me on a cultural equity level because there's so much untapped potential in our community. But it was often not seen because of, whatever
Yeah.
prejudices and misconceptions. And so as we're moving forward, and I know there's sense like that vision that you had about untapped potential. Now you're talking to other business people, industry partners, companies about this. Are you really valuing the people that work for you, and how that benefits? Like, did you come up with a sense of when I do this, it's benefiting the company?
100%. And look, most, that's why the title of the book is Outrageous Empowerment, right? Because that same security guard would be involved in reconciling my bank accounts, and most company owners can't even fathom having a part-time individual that they don't know that might have this skill, giving them access to log into the bank account and wrecking things. I mean, and when I say reconciliation, that they just can't fathom it, and most can't today. And so, sometimes when I talk about that, or I see a lot of leaders and owners say that would never work in our industry, never work. I mean, they're just so sure that the way it is the way it is. And there's one thing that I'm sure of, which is I love to challenge the status quo and flip things on their head, and that's what I was doing. And you talk about the next gig for me, and I guess for me, the outcome of that was, I mean, I almost lost $1 million in 2014, 15. A lot, like I was sole shareholder, almost went bankrupt. And through that process and building company culture, turned the company around. We grew 60%
Mhm.
year over year, sold for 24 times multiple. I was going to give the company away a few years before. And so it was, look, I didn't have to be sold. It literally worked for me. It changed my
Yeah.
company, turned it around. I could see people, really engaged in the business, and turning disgruntled employees into passionate stakeholders, right? That was always my BHAG wasn't a revenue number. It was, could I get people to care? And it was through processes like that and systemizing things like that people started to care. And that, and we use that same philosophy at Vita today. It's different. They're not employees, they're community members and residents, but we're following the same playbook.
Yeah, that's a great segue because as we come to the last few minutes of this great call, I really do thank you again, Ron. I go back and listen to the podcast afterwards, and there's so much learning in it, right? Like it's true analogies and metaphors and following the story, but there's so much to learn from it. So get to Vita, and I'm excited about Vita Living because the concept around empowering tenants is the opposite of slumlords. And
Yeah.
so, which is really exploiting people who really are living in a low rent place because that's all they can afford. But that doesn't mean that the elevator has to smell like urine. It doesn't mean that the carpets have to look terrible. It doesn't mean that the security button's not working. And so, can talk a little bit about the beginning of Vita and how you use that same outrageous empowerment
Mm.
um, kind of concept to owning apartment buildings.
Yeah. So I had owned apartments. My first apartment building was on Lynette Road or Drive in Spryfield. It was a 6 unit. I was 26. I paid, 89,000 for 6 units, right? Like 12 grand a unit or something, whatever the math is on that. And went there, and I think my mortgage was $373, but it brought in 3,600. Everybody was paying 600 for a 2 bedroom, including heat and hot water back then. But back then, I had to meet with everybody, and some people knew me, and I'd meet out. And I bought everybody a case of beer and laid the law. And I said, pay your rent and be a good person, or I'm going to come in here and throw you out. Like, that's how I fell into the category of I'm going to be a rough and tough landlord. That's going to be no BS. You pay your rent and be a good person. Don't damage the place. And that's what this relationship becomes. And so what happened, Augie, is in 2015, something like that, 16, I had bought a 12 unit on Lynette. Sorry, not on Lynette, on Evans Avenue in Fairview, and it was a very tough building, very tough at the time.
I
And
live
shop,
there.
right? So
I
this was
lived in that
56.
building on Evans. Yeah.
Man, it was rough. 50% vacancy, smashed holes in the. And there was a guy from really nice guy, but he was from Egypt, and he was just in over his head, right? He was just getting eaten alive by he butting heads with the customers. It was not working. And so anyway, I bought that with Sean Majumder, who's a comedian, right? You probably know of Sean. Used to be on
I
This
do.
Hours 20 Minutes. So Sean put some money in and put some money up, and we bought this thing. And I was going in with like, okay, roll up my sleeves. I'm going to sort this place out. And then I thought, there's got to be an opportunity to follow the same play from the security company. What if we went back to the drawing board and asked the same question, which helped me in the security business, which was, what if you had to restart this industry? And so to me, what if you had to restart that kind of, back then I called it affordable housing. Today I call it workforce housing. But what if you had to restart that from scratch? What would that look like? And very quickly, through talking to people in the building, around community members, there was 4 things lacking in that section of the market. It was safety and security. You had crap security systems, no security systems, to like crap, locks on the door where tenants from 5 years ago could still get in. They never changed the front door lock, right? And so that was a disaster. It was not clean, no sense of community, and the unorthodox piece is no opportunity for people. So long story short, put a fob entry system in, gave people and cameras so people had more confidence that they could go into from and to and out, in and out of their units. Made sure the building was clean inside and out. That gave people a sense of pride. So now you had pride, confidence. And then we started to get creative. These buildings, these old stick walk-up wood frame buildings without elevators that were made in the 70s, 80s, 90s. There's no amenity rooms. Now buildings gets built. It's like you get this and this and this and this, right? These old buildings weren't built like that. There was not even an office unless it was 40, 50, 60 units. So we had to be creative. We gutted the storage area that was just mice and rat infested, put a gym down there. I donated most of my old gear and bought stuff off Kijiji. We put a library up on the 3rd floor, and all of a sudden we knew something was going on. The temperature had changed, right? People were now interested in what was going on. We started to have barbecue events and doing things. Then the last part of opportunity was back to the security days of getting to know customers, getting to know tenants. And hey, what do you do outside of raising children? Well, I used to paint. Wow, would you be interested in painting? Yes, I would. What did you do? Getting to know people allowed me to tap into the untapped potential and start to get them to participate in what I'll call building the community, fixing the building, cleaning the building, doing all these different things, meeting each other. And so that I knew we were onto something. And then once I knew we were onto something, we just wanted to put a brand on it. And the brand was Vita. And that was also very strategic too, because, as my time in Colombia, I speak Spanish. I love the Spanish culture. And the word Vita is the word for lifetime. And Vita, to me, if you look at, if you go to vitaliving.ca or check us out online, you'll see that the logo visually is made to look like you're going to a spa, not to a property, right? It's supposed to be very welcoming. So it's very intentional, or the look and the color and the word, it's very intentional.
Well, the green is put like that. That is a go. We know that as human, that means go, and it means life, and it means plants and all that. No, it's fantastic work, Ron. I mean, I think about, we try to talk about change, and a lot of times change for people is systemic. And so what you're talking about is a sustainable rethinking of housing and affordable housing, and how that affects a community is tremendous, because we both know the people that are living at that area, we've now, the other end of it is just squeezing them out by upping the rent and that renovation eviction piece. And so where are those people supposed to go? So instead of kicking them out or exploiting them, why not build a gym? Why not get a library? And I know that you had a door painting contest that again got people to have pride. And this is a nice way to kind of wrap up, Ron, because you circled it back to community. So if I come in a building, and I lived on Evans Avenue, this is when I first got back from the Caribbean. I was teaching at Halifax West, that used to be on Dutch Village Road, and that's what I could afford at the time. And there was actually not community; it was fear. Like you got in your house and you're a unit, and you locked up, and even when you left the unit, you weren't sure if your stuff was going to be there when you got back. And so the approach you took. And now I want to just get to how you expanded that as a wrap up, because I know that Vita, you now look for the kind of like medium-sized cities with that same type of housing so that you don't get into the Toronto Montreal thing. But that's happening in more than just Halifax, right? Around these type of buildings.
Yeah, I mean the main pockets were in HRM, obviously, and we look, the one that's been in the media is a 500 block. We essentially acquired the 500 block. We've got to roll up our sleeves. That's our big project now that we want to really finally. That's been a community that's been in the media as of late. We want it to be in the media for the right reasons, not the wrong reasons.
Yes.
And
Yes.
and so we know we've got work to do, and we're going to get it done. And I think you think about what you talked about as far as the door colors, and actually that came from this book, Joyful, which I don't know if that's going on. Yeah, it's an excellent book.
Yes.
It just talks about. I bought this at the Discovery Center when I was down there with the kids, actually, and just noticed it. And the subtitle is "The Surprising Power of Ordinary Things to Create Extraordinary Happiness." And
Yes.
this challenges the status quo. It says, look, it doesn't disagree with depression, mental health, but it does say that what you see, hear, and feel on the exterior can give you happiness. And so it kind of to bring this into a nutshell, if you were having a really crappy day, Augie, and you saw a rainbow, it might give you a moment of joy. And it
Yeah.
talks about things like that, right? Or a baby was to come in your arms, you'd probably have a moment of happiness. And so,
Yes.
we started to paint the door colors to say, like if you walk down these hallways, and you were there in Evans, I mean that's I don't know where you go to be more depressed than one of these hallways.
Yeah.
They're not lit well. It's
Yeah.
horrible. So
Yeah.
you have to push the status quo, and not everybody's going to like it. I'll tell you, some of our customers, we acquire a building, and so they didn't come in through our platform. We bought the building, and they're like, "This is the stupidest thing I've ever heard of," and it's okay. I'm not saying I'm right, but there's a misalignment. And I'll say, if you don't like it, maybe you should live somewhere where you can go back to the hall that it was. But there's some people that really like this. It's these type of things that
Yes.
we do that make people say, I really like this. This is really for me. And that's our customer versus those who say it's not for me. And that's okay too. We're not saying we're right. And so what we do is we try to get everybody on board. So what you were referring to is we run these community contests. So our door colors were 12 colors. And each week we had people name the suites because we're going to name them like they do at cottages, right? Robin's red for the red door.
Nice. Nice.
And so
Nice.
we'll do these community goals. We had a goal of 350 entries. If we did that, we would draw half a month's free rent. And we got to 450. So not only are we drawing 25 gift cards for people that sent names in, but we drew for a half month's free rent and a full month's free rent. So we want people to be encouraged to say, wow, this is kind of cool. Like I get to participate in the future of this community. And it's kind of fun. It's gamified. And hey, I got a gift card or won some free rent. I should really pay attention and tell people that there's some value here,
Yeah, and that leads us to as you and you what strikes me is for someone that said you didn't like school, you read a lot, right? And it goes to show you, right? It's what fits. You have to individualize the experience. So you love learning around traveling. You read a lot. You reference
Yeah.
books. You just showed a book. So I want to end off talking about your recent book, Scaling Culture,
Right.
and you have a podcast, Scaling Culture, as well. So as a kind of like a nice bow to wrap this up, you build a culture around source security. You build a culture around Vita living. What are you saying to other business leaders around scaling culture?
So I think a few things, right? I think as business leaders, the pandemic has changed the narrative and the way we need to be thinking about employees at work because for the most part, you know, and I would have fell into this category for the most part, but and what I mean is pre-pandemic, a lot of companies would say, look, Augie, you work here and I pay you a wage. For that wage, you need to show up and do you need to do a great job here. And I don't care about what happens with you and your family. That's drama. That's none of my business. That was the old way. Now it's, look, Augie, as you working here, I feel like um, what I'd like to provide you is enough benefits and experiences and safety, security, et cetera, to make you the best version of yourself. And for that, I would like the best version of you here. But I feel a strong sense of what's the word, accountability to do that. It's our job as leaders to make and allow people and bring out the best in them through our work environments. And if you do that, then you'll get the best of them at work, if that makes sense. And then I come back
Yeah,
to the
yeah,
simplicity of I look at business like sports. If you want to win the game, you have the best team, and the best team treat the players the best. They work the best.
Yeah.
They have the best training, the best, mental health. They really look at the athlete as a whole. They help their family. I just use the same strategy in business, and if you have the right players, you'll win the game. And so I'm saying we're winning this game. We've scaled so quickly. I couldn't even imagine, 3 years ago, 3.5, we started with 100 units. We have over 2,000 units today here, Winnipeg and Winnipeg and Nova Scotia. So it's because of that team. And so then the question is, how do you do that, right? How do you do that? Because the belief in some people's minds is that culture's fluffy, and it's just fluffy. And again, I probably used to think that as well until I saw the outcomes of it. But those who believe in culture, treating people really well and getting the best of them, don't know how to execute. It's hard to say, well, okay, thanks, Augy, I believe you, but how do I do that? Where do I start? And how do I sustain it? And so scaling culture is the playbook that I never had. And it's everything that I've learned, not just from me and my own experiences, but from podcast guests, from Jeff Immelt from GE to Francis Frey from Harvard, to some of the best thought leaders and best companies, and what they do from different strategies, because you have to be strategic about your culture. That old saying, culture eats strategy for breakfast, is great, because you need to be strategic about your culture or you lose,
Yeah, you're exactly right. And community and culture and personal relationships, making emotional connections with people, being vulnerable, those are all seen as wishy-washy, abstract things. But I agree with you, because empathize others is very much about that too, is no, there's real concrete um, tangible things that you can do, strategies that will help
Tool.
culture. Yeah, and so I want to thank you, Ron, for what you're doing, for having that Halifax Foundation, and now making space, because what you talk about, Ron, which is the beautiful part, it's universally designed. So by business leaders having that scaling culture idea, that equity, diversity, and inclusion is built into that. You don't need to talk about it. We get to know people, whether they're from South Asia, whether they're from Mulgrave Park, whether they're from the South End. It doesn't matter. You're just going to make those connections with them, tap into their untapped potential, build relationships and care for them. So I love what you do. I'm going out to get scaling culture as my read, definitely over the spring, summer, and hopefully you and I can keep in touch. And I love what you're doing. Thank you so much for being on the podcast, Ron.
Thanks, Augy. That's been a great conversation. Thanks. I think the message and conversations that you're having are important for everybody. So keep doing what you're doing.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for watching this episode of Empathize Others, the podcast. We hope that you really enjoyed the show. If you're enjoying the podcast series overall as much as we enjoy making it, make sure that you like, comment, and subscribe. It really helps our channel grow, and when you subscribe, you'll know right away when our new episodes are released.